So remember, you are going to be answering questions about how this image can help you understand what's going on in Anne of Green Gables. You could probably have all of these answers done before I read the chapter, except number 5. We'll talk about that paragraph after we have finished the chapter. We are starting at the bottom of 88, just after Anne has gone home on the day she broke her slate over Gilbert's head. So then, we need to get this set up a little bit better. There we go. All right. If I back up, there's a great deal of difference between being called a crow and being called Carrot, said Anne with dignity. Gilbert Blythe has hurt my feelings excruciatingly. It is possible the matter might have blown over without more excruciation if nothing else had happened. But, foreshadowing, when things begin to happen, they are apt to keep on. Avonlea scholars often spend an hour picking gum in Mr. Bell's spruce grove over the hill and across his big pasture field. So, we've totally changed the subject. The author is giving you some background now. In one-room school days, when it was recess, you did not have to stay in the schoolyard. So these students would go over into the woods that is across the pasture from their schoolhouse. From there, they could keep an eye on Eben Wright's house where the master boarded. So Mr. Phillips went to the place where he lived every day to eat lunch, and this spruce grove, this woods of pine trees, was at a place where they could watch the house where Mr. Phillips went when he ate lunch and see when he was coming back. When they saw Mr. Phillips emerging therefrom, they ran for the schoolhouse. But the distance being about 3 times longer than Mr. Wright's lane, they were very apt to arrive there, breathless and gasping, some 3 minutes too late. So the teacher would be back in school before the students, and the students would come in late. On the following day following what? The day after, Anne hit Gilbert over the head with her slate. On the following day, Mr. Phillips was seized with one of his spasmodic fits of reform. Every once in a while, he tries to make the students follow the rules. That's a spasmodic fit of reform. He announced before going home to dinner that he should expect to find all the scholars in their seats when he returned. So nobody can be late. You all need to be in your seats when Mr. Phillips walks back into the room. Anyone who came in late would be punished. So there's your background. The stage is set. All the boys and some of the girls went to Mr. Bell's spruce grove as usual, fully intending to stay only long enough to pick a chew. But spruce groves are seductive, and yellow nuts of gum beguiling. They picked and loitered and strayed, and as usual, the first thing that recalled them to a sense of the flight of time was Jimmy Glover shouting from the top of a patriarchal old spruce, "Master's coming!" The girls who were on the ground started first and managed to reach the schoolhouse in time, but without a second to spare. The boys, who had to wriggle hastily down from the trees, were later. And Anne, who had not been picking gum at all, but was wandering happily in the far end of the grove, waist deep among the bracken, singing softly to herself, with a wreath of rice lilies on her hair as if she were some wild divinity of the shadowy places, was latest of all. So if we stop it right there, we know that the girls, except Anne, should not be punished. But according to what Mr. Phillips said, he should punish all the boys and Anne, because the boys and Anne were not at the schoolhouse in time. Anne could run like a deer, however, Run she did, with the impish result that she overtook the boys at the door and was swept into the schoolhouse among them, just as Mr. Phillips was in the act of hanging up his hat. So can you picture the schoolhouse now? Hopefully you can better than before you got this assignment, right? So we've got the schoolhouse here. Rearrange it a little bit for you. There you go. So instead of the teacher here, we have Mr. Phillips, and he was in the act of hanging up his hat. Mr. Phillips' brief reforming energy was over. He did not want the bother of punishing a dozen pupils. As a teacher, I know if I say you don't have your homework done in the morning, then you have to stay in at recess. If I say that, I must be willing to carry out having you stay with me at lunch recess. Mr. Phillips was not that kind of teacher. He doesn't want the bother of keeping his word, of keeping his promise. It was necessary to do something to save his word. So he needs to make it look like he meant what he said. So he looked about for a scapegoat, somebody easy to punish, and found it in Anne, who had dropped into her seat, gasping for breath, with her forgotten lily wreath hanging askew over one ear and giving her a particularly rakish and disheveled appearance. Anne Shirley, since you seem to be so fond of the boys' company. Wait a minute, what does he mean? When Anne ran so fast, even though she was late, she caught up with the boys and came in with the boys. So that's what he's referring to. And since you came in with the boys, since you seem to be so fond of the boys' company, we shall indulge your taste for it this afternoon, he said sarcastically. Take those flowers out of your hair and sit with Gilbert Blythe. So instead of sitting with Diana, sit with Gilbert. Does this image help you understand the interactions of some of these students? There we go. The other boys snickered. Diana, turning pale with pity, plucked the wreath from Anne's hair and squeezed her hand. Anne stared at the master as if he turned to stone. Does this image help you understand why Anne is interacting with other students and the teacher like that? Does it help you understand why she is so horrified that she can't sit with Diana, that she has to go over and sit with Gilbert? That might be one way to answer the question, but then you have to explain, what does it show? Why would she be so horrified? Did you hear what I said, Anne? Queried Mr. Phillips sternly. Yes, sir, said Anne slowly, but I didn't suppose you really meant it. I assure you I did. Still with a sarcastic inflection all the children and Anne especially hated. It flicked on the raw. Obey me at once. For a moment, Anne looked as if she meant to disobey. Then, realizing that there was no help for it, she rose haughtily, stepped across the aisle, sat down beside Gilbert Blythe, and buried her face in her arms on the desk. Do you understand that interaction? The fact that as soon as she's sitting next to Gilbert, she puts her head down, buries her face in her hands, and totally ignores everybody else? Ruby Gillis, who got a glimpse of it as it went down, told the others going home from school she'd actually never seen anything like it. It was so white with awful little red spots in it. To Anne, this was as the end of all things. It was bad enough to be singled out for punishment from among a dozen equally guilty ones. It was worse still to be sent to sit with a boy. But that boy should be Gilbert Blythe was heaping insult on injury to a degree utterly unbearable. Anne felt she could not bear it, and it would be of no use to try. Her whole being seethed with shame and anger and humiliation. At first, the other scholars looked and whispered and giggled. Again, those are interactions. What are the other students doing? And why are they finding this different setup so worthy of being whispering and giggled about? And they nudged. But as Anne never lifted her head, and as Gilbert worked fractions as if his whole soul was absorbed in them and them only, they soon returned to their own tasks, and Anne was forgotten. When Mr. Phillips called the history class out, Anne should have gone. But Anne did not move, and Mr. Phillips, who had been writing some verse to Priscilla before he called the class, was thinking about an obstinate rhyme still and never missed her. Once, when nobody was looking, Gilbert took from his desk a little pink candy heart with a gold motto on it, kind of like the candy hearts we give with the sayings on 'em at Valentine's time. This heart said, "You are sweet." He slipped it under the curve of Anne's arm, whereupon Anne arose, took the pink heart gingerly between the tips of her fingers, dropped it on the floor, and ground it to powder beneath her heel, and resumed her position without deigning to bestow a glance at Gilbert. When school was over, Anne marched to her desk, ostentatiously, that means without trying to hide it, ostentatiously took out everything therein, books and writing tablet, pen and ink, testament and arithmetic, and piled them neatly on her cracked slate. "What are you taking all those things home for, Anne?" Diana wanted to know as soon as they were out on the road. She had not dared to ask the question before. "I am not coming back to school any more," said Anne. Diana gasped and stared at Anne to see if she meant it. "Will Marilla let you stay home?" she asked. "She'll have to," said Anne. "I will never go to school to that man again." In other words, Anne hates this teacher. He has humiliated her so much. Until there's a new teacher, she will not go back to this school. "Oh, Anne!" Diana looked as if she were ready to cry. "I do think you're mean. What shall I do? Mr. Phillips will make me sit with that horrid Gertie Pye." So again, why is Diana so upset about who she has to sit with? Does this image help you to understand the interactions of Diana and Anne? That Diana is so disappointed that Anne is going to leave because she thinks she's going to be forced to sit with someone else. "Mr. Phillips will make me sit with that horrid Gertie Pye. I know he will because she's sitting alone. Do come back, Anne." "I'd do most anything in the world for you, Diana," said Anne sadly. "I'd let myself be torn limb from limb if it would do you any good, but I cannot do this, so please don't ask it. You harrow up my very soul. Just think of all the fun you'll miss," mourned Diana. "We're going to build the loveliest new house down by the brook, and we'll be playing ball next week, and you've never played ball, Anne. It's tremendously exciting, and we're going to learn a new song. Jane Andrews is practicing it up now, and Alice Andrews is going to bring a new Pansy book next week, and we're all going to read it out loud chapter about down by the brook, and you know you're so fond of reading out loud, Anne." Nothing moved Anne in the least. Her mind was made up. She would not go to school to Mr. Phillips again. She told Marilla so when she got home. And now I'm going to let the video play for you.
"Nonsense," said Marilla. "It isn't nonsense at all," said Anne, gazing at Marilla with solemn, reproachful eyes. "Don't you understand, Marilla? I've been insulted." "Insulted fiddlesticks. You'll go to school tomorrow as usual." "Oh, no." Anne shook her head gently. "I'm not going back, Marilla. I'll learn my lessons at home, and I'll be as good as I can and hold my tongue all the time if it is possible at all. But I'll not go back to school, I assure you." Marilla saw something remarkably like unyielding stubbornness looking out of Anne's small face. She understood that she would have trouble in overcoming it, but she resolved wisely to say nothing more just then. "I'll run down and see Rachel about it this evening," she thought. "There's no use reasoning with Anne now. She's too worked up, and I've an idea she can be awful stubborn if she takes the notion. Far as I can make out from her story, Mr. Phillips has been carrying matters with a rather high hand, but it would never do to say so to her. I'll just talk it over with Rachel. She sent 10 children to school, and she ought to know something about it. She'll have heard the whole story, too, by this time." Marilla found Mrs. Lynde knitting quilts as industriously and cheerfully as usual. "I suppose you know what I've come about," she said a little shamefacedly. Mrs. Rachel nodded. "About Anne's fuss in school, I reckon," she said. "Tilly Boulter was in on her way home from school and told me about it." "I don't know what to do with her," said Marilla. "She declares she won't go back to school. I never saw a child so worked up. I've been expecting trouble ever since she started to school. I knew things were going too smooth to last. She's so high-strung. What would you advise, Rachel?" "Well, since you've asked my advice, Marilla," said Mrs. Lynde amiably. Mrs. Lynde dearly loved to be asked for advice. "I'd just humor her a little at first, that's what I'd do. It's my belief that Mr. Phillips was in the wrong. Of course it doesn't do to say so to the children, you know. And of course he did right to punish her yesterday for giving way to temper. But today it was different. The others who were late should have been punished as well as Anne, that's what. And I don't believe in making the girls sit with the boys for punishment. It isn't modest. Tilly Boulter was real indignant. She took Anne's part right through and said all the scholars did too. Anne seems real popular among them somehow. I never thought she'd take with them so well." "Then you really think I'd better let her stay home?" said Marilla in amazement. "Yes. That is, I wouldn't say school to her again until she said it herself. Depend upon it, Marilla, she'll cool off in a week or so and be ready to go back of her own accord, that's what. While if you were to make her go back right off, dear knows what freak or tantrum she'd take next and make more trouble than ever. The less fuss made the better, in my opinion. She won't miss much by not going to school as far as that goes. Mr. Phillips isn't any good at all as a teacher. The order he keeps is scandalous, that's what, and he neglects the young fry and puts all his time on those big scholars he's getting ready for Queen's. He'd never have got the school for another year if his uncle hadn't been a trustee. The trustee, for he just leads the other two around by the nose, that's what. I declare, I don't know what education in this island is coming to." Mrs. Rachel shook her head as much as to say if she were only at the head of the educational system of the province, things would be much better managed. Marilla took Mrs. Rachel's advice, and not another word was said to Anne about going back to school. She learned her lessons at home, did her chores, and played with Diana in the chilly purple autumn twilights. But when she met Gilbert Blythe on the road or encountered him in Sunday school, she passed him by with an icy contempt that was thawed by his evident desire to appease her. Diana's efforts as a peacemaker were of no avail. Anne had evidently made up her mind to hate Gilbert Blythe to the end of life. As much as she hated Gilbert, however, did she love Diana, with all the love of her passionate little heart, equally intense likes and dislikes. One evening Marilla, coming in from the orchard with a basket of apples, found Anne sitting along by the east window in the twilight, crying bitterly. "Whatever's the matter now, Anne?" she asked.
"It's about Diana," sobbed Anne luxuriously. "I love Diana so, Marilla. I cannot ever live without her, but I know very well when we grow up that Diana will get married and go away and leave me, and oh, what shall I do? I hate her husband. I just hate him furiously." Well, hang on a minute. Stop and think about it. Think about your best friend, right? If you imagine growing up and having your best friend get married and have to move far away because they've been married, yeah, it doesn't make you real thrilled about the idea. It would have been worse back then because there was no email or phones or planes. So if your best friend grew up, got married, and moved away, you wouldn't see her very much at all. And you wouldn't be able to hear from her very often either. So Anne says, "Diana will get married and go away and leave me, and oh, what shall I do? I hate her husband. I just hate him furiously. I've been imagining it all out, the wedding and everything. Diana dressed in snowy garments with a veil and looking beautiful and regal as a queen, and me, the bridesmaid, with a lovely dress too and puffed sleeves, but with a breaking heart hid beneath my smiling face, and then bidding Diana goodbye." Here Anne broke down entirely and wept with increasing bitterness. Marilla turned quickly away to hide her twitching face, but it was no use. She collapsed on the nearest chair and burst into such a hearty peal of laughter that Matthew, crossing the front yard outside, halted in amazement. When had he heard Marilla laugh like that before? "Well, Anne Shirley," said Marilla as soon as she could speak, "if you must borrow trouble, for pity's sake, borrow it handier home. I should think you had an imagination, sure enough. So to summarize the end of chapter 15, hopefully you can fit chapter 15b here yet too. We're not going to write the title down because it's the same as above. Main characters here: Anne, Diana, Mr. Phillips, Gilbert. I said we wouldn't write his last name again, so we won't. What happens in school this time? Anne and the boys are late after lunch. Mr. Phillips punishes Anne by making her sit beside Gilbert. Anne decides not to go back to school. Our next summary for chapter 16 will be on the following page, but do be sure that you have all of these summaries. If you have missed any at any point, you need to make sure you get it. And if you don't have space on the page because you missed putting it in order, it would be a good idea to get another piece of notebook paper, cut a strip, and just tape the strip on so that you can look underneath. So like, let's say you had skipped chapter 12, you would have chapter 11 and then a strip of notebook paper that you would tape so that it covered part of 11 and part of 13. That's where you would write chapter 12 so that you could lift it up yet and read what you had written for chapter 13 since you didn't leave space for chapter 12. So keep that in mind. If you miss the summaries of any chapter, we are summarizing every chapter as we go along. Summaries include the important actions in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and it helps you keep track of a long book like Anne of Green Gables. Make sure you do go ahead and pull up the written assignment for today that looks like this. And if you need, or if you choose to do it online, it looks like this, and you can type right into those boxes. Just use words of the question to begin your answers for 1 and 2 and 4. Number 3, you only need to list because it asks for 3 facts. Number 5 needs to be a paragraph.